There we go. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is February the 23rd, 2023. We're on the eve of the first anniversary of the Ukraine-Russia war. How quickly a year goes, and so much has happened. There you see our headlines for the day on the energy markets and a few other articles that may be impacting that. I'm delighted to be joined today by Lori Haitian, Media Director of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Vandana Hari, Founder and CEO of Vanda Insights, and Mehmet Oguchu, Group CEO of Global Resources Partnership and Chairman of the London Energy Club. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Vandana, let's go to you first for some oil energy markets sort of insight in terms of trajectory. We've seen from the commentators we talk to often, the last month has been more or less stable, relatively speaking, compared to the year that we've seen. So what's your outlook now going forward? You know, again, we're continuing to have mixed signals on every front, whether it's from supply and demand scenarios. Are we any sort of closer to getting a clear trajectory for the next quarter or two?
Good afternoon, everyone from Singapore, and thanks for the question, Diala. So are we closer to figuring out which way the markets, oil prices will go this year? The short answer to that is no. I think the two main variables that are sort of still hanging like a sword above the market are obviously the trajectory of global economic growth. And, within that US growth and within further as a subset, what the Fed does with its rate hiking cycle are basically the main determinants. And the other, of course, is how does China fare in revving up its economy post-COVID? So though both those variables, are going to be, first of all, they're going to be in flux, I think, at least through the remainder of, this year. Certainly for the next few months, I think, especially which way China is going, the market has been kept guessing to some extent. So that's what we have seen, and you were right. There was some stability in prices, a rally through January, then some stability, and that stability completely evaporated. Of course, last week we've seen 7 to 8% slump in crude prices, almost completely led by the Fed pivot hopes starting to disappear, essentially.
Okay, I mean, again, that Fed talk, it does seem to be maybe confusing everybody, because they're taking a neutral stance, like China is on the war in Europe, I suppose. You know, they're really hedging their bets there and sort of saying anything's possible. But thanks, Vanda. Mehmet, good morning to you. And my best wishes for a continuous recovery operation for Turkey and its citizens. We're all watching with dismay in the last 2 weeks, and we're wishing you all the best for recovery there. Mehmet, let's talk a bit about oil prices, but in the context of Europe and the economies there, if you like. We're getting, the last month or two, much more positive sentiment about European economies, including perhaps Central Europe as well, in terms of how bad they have suffered or from inflation and the recovery from that. What is the feeling there and sentiment in Europe in terms of consumption, let's say, going forward from economic activity? We've seen gas and oil prices, calm down a lot since last year, particularly gas. So where are sort of governments and what's the sentiment there for consumption going forward? And have the fears of high energy prices been put to the side?
Well, some sort of reassurance now is in play in Europe, because if you remember a couple of months ago, we were talking about harsh winters in Europe, plus Europe losing its competitiveness in global markets in the face of rising energy prices, especially in Germany, which is the driver of the European economies. But right now, as you say, gas prices has come down significantly, because it has risen almost 8 times compared to the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And the oil prices also stabilizing somehow. And also Europe has been able to find new sources. And I was just talking to a German colleague today. He was telling me that Germany's LNG import capacity will hit almost 7.7 million tons by 2030. And they are finding some alternative sources, also by pipeline coming from Norway and North Africa. Likewise, the ceiling prices for oil, and these are also included in the sanctions recently. Despite all this, I think Europe is doing well, not only finding new sources, but also slacking the demand significantly. So the demand has declined in Europe, both for gas and oil. And while they are finding new sources, the question is, what is the cost of new sources coming on stream to Europe? And quite high, especially for LNG. And oil is, since it's a global commodity, more or less they are able to get the global prices. So I think we haven't seen the worst yet in European economies. Demand is declining somehow, and the supply situation is not as bad as we forecast it's going to be.
No, and of course, I mean, in terms of gas into Europe last year, what we saw was that Europe was able to, obviously, they navigated, as you said, with demand deficiencies, but also China wasn't pulling on any of that demand. Now it might come back into the game. And again, we're going to see what happens there with LNG prices. Last year, Europe was competing better for those. Laurie, good morning. How are you? Good to see you again. Let's stick with oil, essentially. Let's talk a bit about OPEC in the context of Russia, OPEC Plus. Its move last week to declare, a unilateral cut in production. Now there's talk of what will the next declaration be again. Is that just basically, practically speaking, the fact that it's having to cut its production because of sanctions, etc., or do you see this as more sort of posturing from Russia?
Well, I would be the last one to think or to say what Russia is thinking of doing and why it's doing what it's doing. I thought they will never go to war, and look at that, and going to war, and now even there are all these news coming out that they might use airstrikes even like as a second phase of the war after 1 year, that they couldn't do that a quick win that they were wishing for. So I wish all the best for like, my sympathy goes to the Ukrainian people, and I don't want to see any war any place. Anyway, so basically, let's say that there were a lot of analysis saying that Russia will not be immune against all these sanctions that are being put on its sector. We know, we're hearing about all these data saying that, it's not the oil export hasn't been impacted, and then they have found new ways to sell it, and now they're going more and more and selling to Russia, to India, to sell it to China because it's discounted. So these are new markets where they prefer, and then the smuggling, because they're good in smuggling. All of that saying that this is not going to be affected. But at the end of the day, there are sanctions, and these ways are not the proper way for a producing country to keep doing things. So most probably, it's like both are taken into consideration, like capabilities of continuing with producing and kind of maybe at certain point even losing with that discounted money, because at the end of the day, they want to make money to keep the war and to keep the stability in the country. So they cannot like really rely on just like discounted oil. And there might be as well technical issues driving this issue of cutting. Yesterday, I was hearing here Sarah Akbar, which I think she's one of the people that understand the technicalities. And she said, like, they don't have the know-how after all these years. And when the international companies have pulled out, most of them pulled out, if not all. So this will have an impact on the production. So I think it's kind of like technical, but at the same time as well, like economic, and plus they want to put more and more pressure, and maybe testing OPEC plus as well.
Do you think they are testing? I mean, a lot of people last week were saying, well, this was already agreed with Saudi Arabia, essentially, that Saudi sanctioned this Russia to go ahead, no problem. It's not an issue for them.
Yeah, because Saudi Arabia is saying that we're not going to change anything in the decision that we have taken, and this will last till the end of the year. So we're not going to change. It could be that it is orchestrated. At the same time, the sense is after one year of war, are we going into certain type of are you with us or against us type of thing? Because until now, to say that since the war had started, we were not in that situation where the US or the Russians and China expecting from countries to be either with us or against us. It showed how the world has been very interconnected. And there were countries that were they were not ready to take sides either with this or that. Could be that we're going into that direction. I doubt, but again, let's see what the phase 2 of this war, if we say that phase 1 was the first year, where are we going with phase 2 with all these geopolitics and China coming into and stepping in? I don't know in which direction will they support the Russians or not in the war. That could be a game changer, but let's wait and see.
Well, I mean, we had a lot of those meetings this week, declarations. We had Biden, obviously, in Poland and the region saying they will defend every inch of NATO, apart from Ukraine so far. And of course, Putin with his speech. And you mentioned China, and they certainly they just had a meeting with the top diplomat from Russia again, as they did a year ago before Russia invaded Ukraine. So China's maintaining neutral stance. Vandana, back to you. On that, in terms of the second year of the war we're going into, I mean, we've seen, an impact from the war on energy prices last year. Obviously, that dissipated as the year went on, possibly. Do you expect that we will see same volatility as a result of this continuation of this war this year on prices, or has that now been sort of factored in, if you like, in terms of the impact on Russia, Russian supply, etc., now that we know where we're at?
So much of the volatility last year, and especially to the upside, and the price spikes that we saw in oil as well as in gas, were driven by a fear premium, which was but the market basically positioning for the worst to happen. So as progressively the war continued to fester, beyond what people had initially hoped or expected. And then there was successive rounds of sanctions against Russia. And then we had, of course, the EU banning crude imports from December 5 and, refined products subsequently earlier this month. The market at each stage basically was not very sure how to assess that situation. And typically what happens in those cases is you price in the worst, at least until proven otherwise. So we saw quite a bit of that happening last year. But then as events unfolded, it turned out that, first of all, the crude was, as Laurie was mentioning, the crude that was locked out of the EU has been more or less absorbed into China and India. So our calculations show that, as of now, China and India together importing give it roughly 3 million barrels per day of Russian crude, which is nearly double of what they were importing this time last year, or pre-Ukraine invasion.
No signs they're going to stop. No signs they're going to stop that anyway.
No,
India,
why should they?
Regardless of politics, we're going to import cheap crude. But just to stay with you, Vandana, but on the products, of course, had more recently the embargo put on that and sanctions. Again, we have an article today saying that Russian diesel is trying to find a home. Again, very dependent on Europe to intake. Where do you see that going now? We're it's 2 to 3 weeks into that new price cap, if you like.
Yeah, so this also goes a little bit into your original question of the factors behind last year's volatility and the nature and shape of this year's volatility. So I think the volatility in terms of the market at every step, sort of flying blind, trying to assess, trying to factor in what amount of disruption there might be in Russian oil supply. I think that has largely dissipated. You're right. I think a lot needs to still to unfold in terms of product reshuffling of refined product flows from Russia. And I think it's a well accepted fact in the market now that's going to be far difficult for Russia to do than crude. There aren't any obvious big ready markets sitting to absorb the refined products like China and India were for crude. It's a much more fragmented market. Products tankers are smaller. Some shipping analysts I speak with say that there's probably a shortage of tankers, especially if Russia has to send its refined products to farther away destinations, for instance, in Africa and Latin America. But going back to the point on volatility and what to look out for this year, I think it's going to be mostly the constant recalibration that will be needed in terms of the outlook for the global economy. Certainly within that, the US economy and how Europe fares, even though the sentiment is a little bit better now since late last year, especially for Europe. And to a close second will be Chinese reopening. And as you mentioned earlier, that is keeping the markets guessing, at least as far as the last several weeks post reopening are concerned. No really tangible, clear signals to the market that Chinese appetite is rebounding very quickly.
But of course, a lot of the intentions are there. All the intentions of that their opening is there. A lot of people now are saying we'll really see that kick in the second half of this year. But certainly from a policy point of view, they're pushing that argument. We have our question that's just come up there, our poll. Will a second year of war in Europe bring more or less volatility to energy prices? As I just asked Vandana, so we'll get our viewers sort of perspective on that, more or less. Are we going to see more volatility, or are we kind of settled now into a sort of more predictive scenario, let's say? Mehmet, back to you. Let's talk a bit about Turkey and the situation there. In terms of, obviously, President Erdogan now has his hands full dealing with this crisis. He already had an economic crisis, and now he has, a humanitarian one, which will impact also economy. Elections coming up for him in a few months. How is that going to, does the recent problem with the earthquake impact at all his intentions, politically speaking? How does it impact the positioning that he's been making, even geopolitically, as a sort of middleman in Europe for the conflict that's going on?
Thank you. Well, before I come to that, I just want to add a point about the sanctions and its impact on Russia. I was in Riyadh, and I had the opportunity to meet also Prince Abdulaziz, the Minister of Energy. I asked him this question, and his answer, of course, he didn't want to get into political interpretation of that, but he said clearly from the energy point of view, sanctions on Russia may not work because it's going to affect, at the end of the day, supply situation in the world at a time when the world needs energy so much. So let's not use energy as a political weapon, more or less was his message. I want to mention that. And also the recent summit in Munich Security Conference, the Chinese were there, Iranians and Russians were not invited. And Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, made it quite clear that we are moving into Cold War mentality. And immediately after, he flew to Moscow. There he announced that our solidarity with Russia is as solid as rock. So there is a sharpening of polarization. I want to put this on one side. So about
but just before you go on to Turkey, then on that point of China-Russia solidarity, I mean, how does that? I mean, I understand the statements they're making that they did that a year ago. They've been doing it all year. But what about China's economic interests? Because that's a big priority for them now, isn't it? They're not floating on 8% growth anymore, and they're making a big effort domestically to get consumption up, and they rely on an export market, which is essentially the West. How do you think? Not to put yourself in their mind, but when is China going to have to make its mind up on not going too far in this support of Russia for the sake of its economy? Is there a conflict there, do you think?
Well, in the global system right now, I think geopolitics play a more prominent role than economics. Of course, economics are important. Clinton, you remember, said it's economy stupid. But now they are saying it's geopolitics stupid. So the new balance of power in the world, where China clearly sees that the West would like to crush Russia. through sanctions, through military aid to Ukraine and all other means. So they have to make a decision, although they stayed more or less neutral in many sense. But right now, Putin, Biden, when he was in Kiev, he said Putin will face the iron will of the West. So immediately afterwards, China had to show solidarity with Russia. Therefore, that's more political posturing. As you say, economics are more important, because if you look at the figures, Chinese-Russian trade is around $155 billion, whereas Chinese trade volume with the West is about $3.3 trillion. So at a time when China needs more investment, while we have the Western companies, multinationals are pulling out of supply chains. So it shows that what Chinese are talking about, Cold War mentality, probably will be more important than economic interests relatively. Therefore, I think we will see a more geopolitical repositioning around the world, and China and Russia in that case will not tolerate the West coming and trying to bite their significant interest, geopolitically speaking. This will have its impact, of course, on economy, relocations, on oil markets, gas markets. We'll see how it's developing. But my opinion is that geopolitics will play a more important role than economic and energy interests in the medium to long term. So we have to prepare ourselves for that. Coming to Turkey, as you say, the elections was slated to take place on 14 May, presidential and general elections for parliament. And it looks likely that it's not going to happen because of this terrible devastation, earthquake created, not only economically, but politically as well. It had shattered President Erdogan's political standing, and because there was some delay in government response and people felt helpless. This is the region where Erdogan's AKP has its strongholds. And now it's likely that he might lose some of his claim to leadership and some of the votes in the region. This is coming on top of, as you said, COVID and then economic fragility, because Turkey has to pay around $190 billion of foreign debt this year, plus more than $30 billion of current account deficit, plus FDI is not inflowing Turkey, because last year it was about $4.7 billion. Compare this with $17 billion in 2017. There's outflow of Turkish capital to other countries looking for safe havens. And therefore, the election is not going to be an easy win for Erdogan, whether it's going to be held in May or in June as originally planned. So we have to see. I mean, I think it doesn't make a big difference whether in May or June, but Erdogan is putting all his energies now to regain confidence among the electors. Whether it might be delayed or postponed to next year, this is also on the cards. We don't know how it's going to move, because he might say that there is an emergency situation in the country, although Constitution doesn't allow that. It's only on the condition of a war that Turkey President and Parliament may postpone it. Yeah, so we shall see. But we'll see. It's going to be very tough period. But also good news is that thanks to earthquake, there is a new sort of humanitarian diplomacy evolving. Turkey's relations with the West. Antony Blinken was in Ankara for the first time since he became the Secretary of State. And with European Union, there is some easing of tensions, and so many countries contributing to Turkish earthquake relief as well. So this is what I call earthquake diplomacy, perhaps bringing some positive element to Turkey's geopolitical standing.
Yeah, I mean, as it should be, that humanitarian comes first. But interesting, you say that it's not a sure thing now that you will win, obviously, because of, and whereas a few months ago there was no other contenders, so he may want to delay the vote. Laurie, back to you. Just let's talk about revenue, debt, economies, and Iran a little bit. Iran is a country and an economy under great duress. And the protests that we've seen in the last few months are sort of the final straw. People are just completely fed up. Putting ideology aside and what they may be against there, the takeaway is that people cannot. They need a change. So where are we at now with Iran in terms of the nuclear deal is being declared dead in the water until something changes with how they're dealing with protesters, etc. or until Iran makes its intentions clearer to compromise. Where do you see that going this year? Will we see that? I mean, is it a desperate enough situation that the regime will have to go back to the negotiating table?
Look, and you have to have another party to negotiate with, right? You cannot negotiate on your own. I think what's happening is that the EU and the Americans are watching what Iran is doing vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. And sending these drones to Russia is not insignificant. And therefore, so now you're adding on top of all the internal problems that they're happening, and the crushing of the revolution or the uprisings, and not doing any kind of open up gesture internally to these protesters and to the demands of the protesters, and then sending drones to Russia, taking sides with Russia. These two make it really hard for the US or for the Europeans to go back to the table of the negotiations and to negotiate as if nothing has happened, and let's take it from where we ended before the war in Russia. That said, the problem, I guess, that why the US and the Europeans are not closing the door completely, it's that nuclear possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear, having the nuclear bomb. But I guess that from what we are seeing, this is where the destination of the Iranian regime is. They feel that they are weak, and with the internal weaknesses that are happening, they have the possibility of going to that extra mile and crossing the red line and becoming having that bomb, which will bring them stronger to the table, if any table is there to negotiate from a different standpoint than where they are today. So this is, I think, how the Iranians are thinking, and being like having Russia on their side, and later if maybe China on their side. So then they feel that, okay, we are going to the other camp. We don't need anymore the Americans and the EU and staying all the time under the mercy of an administration that comes anytime, decides that, yes, now we do a deal, now we don't do a deal. If they are a powerful force, then no one can play with them that game. So I think this is where the Iranians are. Let's see with the implementation, and let's see how the US or the EU or maybe even Israel are willing to accept that fact that this is where Iran is heading, or not. But I guess this is the situation. They cannot let go because of the nuclear power weapons, but at the same time, they have all these constraints or all these obstacles to any come back to the table, at least under the old conditions, if you want. So again, this is one of the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war: what to do with the JCPOA if it still exists, or what to do with Iran. Same as like what to do next with Turkey after the elections and the results of the elections. What to do with Turkey, how to deal with Turkey. So I think this war is not insignificant at all. It's creating shifts in geopolitics at the same time in the oil and gas. So we're seeing these two transitions happening, and all of that under the umbrella of the energy transition, which brings like the UAE, Saudi Arabia into that, like into this whole, if you want, picture about their position as well about the energy transition. And then you go to the other situation where it's very clear what's happening with the industrial plans that are being put place in the US and in the EU, in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, where they want to bring back manufacturing of everything related to energy transition and renewables to the US. The EU, looking at that, for now, they are really don't want to go into competition with the US because they have the bigger enemy, China. China is not happy with all these new industrial plans that might take away from them, but they're far away. Like, you know, one issue about these critical minerals, far away. We are seeing all this information coming out, how far they are. They have the Chinese are in processing, manufacturing all these things, all the products, materials that are related to the future of energy, which is like renewables, etc., and how the US and the EU are trying to catch up today. So there is a lot that is happening while the war is going on. There are geopolitical changes, energy changes, and like we need to take it from that perspective and enjoy the ride, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's getting much and much more complicated, and energy transition, I fear it's going on. But when you mention that word now, you know, we're not talking about it as much anymore. There's too much else going on. But of course, that is running on the parallel path to all of this at the same time. Vandana, back to you, just in terms of outlook. We've got a minute or so left. In terms of direction for the markets going ahead. I mean, you started by saying that, you know, it all depends. China's this, China that. We're still waiting to see that pull, if you like, on demand from China. We haven't seen their imports. I mean, their demand may be going up, but they have a lot of inventory, don't they? How long will that last, even if we see some more demand domestically? And just give us an update on what's expected also from their point of view on product exports from China in terms of their refining industry and how that's impacting pricing.
Yeah, so what doesn't help the markets is a degree of opacity around China's stockpiles, and you know that's for commercial stockpiles as well as the strategic inventories. What the market does go by is the monthly customs imports data. So, you know, you look at how much crude has been buying, then you get some official data on their refining, and then analysts try and deduce what the end user demand might be as a result of that. A slight complication, of course, not unexpected at this time of the year, is that the January and February customs data on crude imports gets delayed as a result of the Lunar New Year break. So we have still not seen any official data. What I have seen from some news agencies, again, tracking through ship tracking data, is that Chinese imports have recovered a little bit in January. I think the market has been paying probably close attention to what's happening in the spot market. So again, we see premiums have been improving for crudes, and especially, you know, Russian crudes have been doing a little bit better. Of course, they're at steep discounts still, but lesser discounts. So that has that reflects growing Chinese appetite, and some Middle Eastern crudes premiums have also improved. So, but all said and done, you know, when you look at what China might be, how it might be able to will it jump from first to fourth gear? Probably not. You know, I think we probably underestimate the impact to which the impact that 3 years of zero COVID have had in suppressing its economic growth. So personally, I feel, Diala, that we'll probably see an initial spurt, which is already underway in terms of certainly jet fuel demand, gasoline demand. But the bulk of use in China is diesel demand, which is more directly tied with its manufacturing, its exports, you know, in terms of transporting goods. I was reading a report earlier this week about a mile-long queue of empty containers at terminals in Guangdong because the export orders are just not coming in. So to my mind, the bigger question, you know, after the initial spurt of, you know, just simply people being able to move more freely, of course, demand goes up. The bigger question after that is how does China actually stimulate its economy, its growth, you know, whether it's domestic consumption or whether it's manufacturing and exports. We'll hear some more on their fiscal stimulus plans next month with the annual legislative meeting on, you know, how they plan to kickstart the economy. But until then, it's wait and watch for the markets. What I do see very clearly is that markets are not yet ready to jump headlong into the China reopening story.
Right, interesting. And also, of course, you mentioned that they're planning obviously a new fiscal declaration next month. We didn't today mention the Fed, the US Fed, and what's recently been done in terms of that. And of course, what they're doing impacts consumption in the West, which impacts manufacturing in China. So all of this is linked and sort of in flux at the moment. We had our survey question result up there. 71% say that we're going to see less volatility in the second year of war in Ukraine. People are getting used to the status quo, which is obviously not a great thing, but maybe that's the way it is. But thank you. We've run out of time. We've gone over time. I'm sorry to keep you all. Thank you, Laurie and Mehmet and Vandana for joining us today, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.